In the land of ghost towns and railroad tracks, Montana became home to a real ghost in 2009. Emma Richardson disappeared on her way home from farm work, vanishing without a trace across miles of open terrain. For 15 years, Montana's harsh winters and endless summers kept this secret buried. Until genetic genealogy technology finally unmasked one of the community's most trusted members as a killer. Before diving into this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to stay updated with the latest cold case investigations. September 12, 2009. The vast Montana sky stretched endlessly above the Richardson family ranch, painted in the deep amber hues of late summer. In the distance, the crazy mountains rose like ancient sentinels against the horizon, their peaks already dusted with the first promise of winter snow. This was Big Sky country at its most magnificent, a landscape so vast and open that it seemed to swallow human concerns into its infinite expanse. The Richardson Ranch sprawled across 12,000 acres of prime Montana rangeland, a testament to 4 generations of hard-working pioneers who had carved their lives from this unforgiving but spectacular wilderness. Established in 1899 by Emma's great-grandfather, Jeremiah Richardson, the ranch had survived drought, economic depression, brutal winters, and the changing face of American agriculture through sheer determination and an unbreakable connection to the land. Emma Richardson, 22, walked across the pasture toward the main ranch house, her boots crunching on the dried grass that would soon be buried under Montana's legendary snowfall. She had spent the day helping with the cattle, preparing for the seasonal roundup that would bring the herd down from the summer pastures before the brutal winter set in. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her work clothes bore the honest dust of a full day's labor under the endless Montana sky. The work had been particularly demanding that day. Emma and the ranch hands had been moving a stubborn group of cattle from the high meadows, a job that required both horsemanship skills and an intimate knowledge of animal behavior. The cattle were reluctant to leave the sweet grass of the summer pastures, sensing the approaching change of seasons that would confine them to winter feeding areas closer to the ranch buildings. Emma possessed an almost supernatural ability to read cattle behavior, a skill that had earned her respect from ranch hands twice her age. She could predict which direction a spooked cow would run, knew which animals would lead the herd and which would cause trouble, and had a gentle but firm way of handling even the most difficult livestock. It was a gift that seemed to run in the Richardson family, passed down through generations of cattle ranchers who had learned to work with rather than against the natural instincts of their animals. Emma's got the touch, her father Jim would often tell visitors to the ranch. Some folks fight the cattle, try to force them to do what they want. Emma just understands them, knows how to make them want to go where she needs them to go. It's like watching an artist at work. The Richardson Ranch was more than just a business to Emma. It was her calling, her identity, and her future all rolled into one. While her older brothers had left for college and urban careers, Emma had always known that this land, this life, was where she belonged. She had completed 2 years of agricultural business studies at Montana State University in Bozeman, but had returned home to help manage the ranch operations and prepare to eventually take over the family business. The economics of ranching in Montana were challenging and constantly changing. Beef prices fluctuated with global markets, land values were rising due to wealthy outsiders buying ranch property for recreational use, and environmental regulations made some traditional ranching practices more difficult. Emma had thrown herself into learning the business side of the operation, studying commodity markets, land management techniques, and sustainable ranching practices that would allow the Richardson Ranch to remain viable for future generations. She was particularly interested in developing agritourism opportunities that would supplement the ranch's income from cattle sales. Emma had been working on plans to offer hunting expeditions, guest ranch experiences, and educational tours that would allow city dwellers to experience authentic ranch life while generating additional revenue for the operation. Emma sees the big picture, her mother Carol often said. She understands that ranching isn't just about raising cattle anymore. You have to diversify, find new ways to make the land pay for itself. But she also knows that any changes have to respect our traditions and our connection to this place. As Emma approached the ranch house that September afternoon, she could see her father working on a section of fence near the barn. The wooden posts and wire barriers that crisscrossed the ranch represented thousands of hours of labor and constant maintenance. In country this vast and harsh, Good fences were essential for managing livestock and maintaining property boundaries. Jim Richardson looked up from his work and waved to his daughter. At 58, he was still a powerful man, his body hardened by decades of ranch work, his face weathered by countless days under the Montana sun. He had taken over the ranch from his own father 30 years earlier and had built it into one of the most successful cattle operations in Park County. The Richardson family embodied everything that people admired about Montana ranch families. They were hardworking, self-reliant, honest, and deeply connected to the land that sustained them. They were also active members of their community, participating in local organizations, supporting their neighbors during difficult times, and maintaining the traditions that had defined rural Montana life for over a century. "I'm heading to town to pick up those parts for the tractor," Emma called across the yard, her voice carrying easily in the clear mountain air. "Should be back before supper." Jim nodded acknowledgement without looking up from his fence repair work. It was a routine trip. Emma often drove the 30-mile round trip to Livingston for ranch supplies, and she knew the roads as well as anyone. The route was simple and familiar: out the ranch road to the county highway, then straight into town along a ribbon of asphalt that cut through some of the most spectacular scenery in America. The drive to Livingston was one that Emma had made hundreds of times, but she never tired of the view. The road wound through a valley that seemed designed to showcase Montana's natural grandeur. Rolling hills covered in native grasses stretched to the horizon, broken by occasional stands of cottonwood and aspen trees that followed the creek beds. In the distance, mountain ranges rose on all sides, the Crazies to the east, the Bridges to the south, and the Absarokas to the north. This was the landscape that had drawn settlers to Montana for over a century, promising freedom, opportunity, and a chance to build something lasting in one of America's last great wildernesses. But it was also a landscape that could be unforgiving to those who underestimated its power or failed to respect its dangers. Emma climbed into the family's 2005 Chevy Silverado, a workhorse truck that had seen countless trips between the ranch and town. The vehicle was practical rather than pretty, equipped with heavy-duty suspension, oversized tires, and a powerful engine that could handle the demands of ranch work. The truck bed was fitted with a toolbox and cattle guards, and the interior bore the honest wear of a vehicle that was used for work rather than show. She adjusted the rearview mirror and started the engine, country music filling the cab from the radio station out of Bozeman. The familiar sounds of steel guitar and heartfelt lyrics about small-town life and enduring love provided a soundtrack that perfectly matched the rhythm of rural Montana life. As Emma drove down the long gravel driveway toward the county road, dust rose behind her in a brown plume that hung in the still air. The driveway stretched for nearly a mile from the ranch house to the main road, flanked by fence lines and occasional cattle guards that prevented livestock from wandering onto the county highway. The isolation that characterized much of rural Montana life was both a blessing and a potential danger. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and the closest town of any size was 30 miles distant. This remoteness provided peace, privacy, and a connection to the natural world that was increasingly rare in modern America. But it also meant that help could be far away when trouble struck. That was the last time anyone in the Richardson family saw Emma alive. As afternoon turned to evening on September 12, 2009, the temperature began to drop in the characteristic way of high-altitude Montana autumn weather. The sun, which had blazed from a cloudless sky all day, was beginning to sink toward the western mountains, painting the landscape in long shadows and golden light. Carol Richardson was preparing dinner in the ranch house kitchen, expecting Emma to return at any moment with the tractor parts they needed for the next day's work. The kitchen was the heart of the Richardson home, a warm and welcoming space filled with the aromas of home cooking and the comfortable clutter of a family that had lived and worked together for generations. The walls were decorated with family photos spanning 4 generations of Richardson ranchers, showing the evolution of the ranch from a small homestead to a substantial cattle operation. There were pictures of roundups and brandings, family gatherings and community celebrations, all documenting the rich history of a family deeply rooted in Montana soil. By 6 o'clock, Carol was beginning to feel the first stirrings of concern. Emma was punctual by nature and rarely late without calling. The family had strict policies about communication and checking in, born from years of experience with the potential dangers of ranch life and the isolation of rural Montana. By 7 o'clock, concern had escalated to worry. Carol tried calling Emma's cell phone repeatedly, but the calls went straight to voicemail. In the sparse cell coverage of rural Montana, this wasn't necessarily alarming. There were significant dead zones throughout Park County where phones couldn't find a signal. But combined with Emma's failure to return home or call, it began to paint a troubling picture. Jim came in from his fence work as the sun was setting, expecting to find Emma already home and helping with dinner preparations. When Carol told him that their daughter hadn't returned from town, his weathered face immediately showed concern. "Did she say anything about stopping anywhere else?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Emma's trip to Livingston had been for a specific purpose, picking up tractor parts from the John Deere dealer, and she wasn't the type to make social calls without letting her family know. By 8 o'clock, with darkness settling over the valley and the temperature dropping toward freezing, both parents knew that something was wrong. Emma had said she'd be back by supper, and she was never late without calling. More troubling was the fact that her cell phone was going straight to voicemail, suggesting either that it was turned off or that she was in an area with no coverage. Jim decided to drive the route to town himself, hoping to find Emma broken down somewhere along the road. He took the same county highway Emma would have taken, driving slowly and scanning the shoulders and ditches for any sign of the silver dew. The September night was clear and cold, with a moon bright enough to illuminate the landscape in silver light that made the vast Montana countryside look both beautiful and somehow ominous. The drive to Livingston normally took about 25 minutes, following State Highway 89 through a valley that showcased some of Montana's most spectacular scenery. During the day, the route offered views of snow-capped mountains, rolling grassland, and the occasional glimpse of wildlife. At night, it became a ribbon of asphalt cutting through an ocean of darkness, with only the occasional ranch light visible in the distance. Jim drove all the way to Livingston without seeing any trace of his daughter or the truck. At the John Deere dealership where Emma had planned to stop, the night security guard confirmed that no one matching her description had visited the store that day. The parts she had come to pick up were still sitting on the counter, waiting for pickup. A growing knot of fear began to form in Jim's stomach as he realized that Emma had vanished somewhere between the ranch and town, a 30-mile stretch of highway that passed through some of the most isolated country in Montana. The terrain along the route was mostly open rangeland, broken by occasional steep-sided coulees and creek beds where a vehicle could conceivably disappear from view. On his return trip, Jim drove even more slowly, using a powerful flashlight to search areas where a vehicle might have left the road. He stopped at several points to get out and walk areas where the terrain might hide a crashed vehicle, calling Emma's name into the vast Montana night and listening for any response. The silence that answered his calls was profound and unsettling. In the city, night time still contained the constant hum of human activity, traffic, machinery, the distant sounds of civilization. But rural Montana at night was genuinely quiet, a silence so complete that it seemed to have physical weight. The only sounds were the whisper of wind through grass and the occasional distant howl of a coyote. At 11 o'clock, Jim Richardson called the Park County Sheriff's Office to report his daughter missing. The call was logged by dispatcher Sarah Martinez, who had grown up in the area and knew the Richardson family well. The gravity in Jim's voice was unmistakable. This wasn't a father overreacting to a young adult being slightly late. This was a man who knew his daughter and understood that her failure to return home indicated something was seriously wrong. Within 20 minutes, Deputy Mike Stevens was en route to the ranch to take a formal report. Stevens had been with the Park County Sheriff's Office for 8 years and understood the unique challenges of law enforcement in rural Montana. The county covered over 2,600 square miles but had only 12 full-time deputies to patrol an area larger than the state of Delaware. Response times could stretch to an hour or more in the remote areas, and the vast distances made coordination between agencies a constant challenge. "When someone goes missing in Park County, we have to move fast," Stevens would later explain. "The territory is so big and the population so spread out that a person can vanish without anyone seeing them for days. And with winter coming on, exposure becomes a life-or-death factor." Deputy Stevens arrived at the Richardson Ranch just after midnight, his patrol car's headlights cutting through the darkness as he navigated the long gravel driveway to the main house. The ranch buildings were illuminated by yard lights that cast harsh shadows against the surrounding darkness, creating an island of visibility in the vast Montana night. Stevens conducted a thorough interview with Jim and Carol Richardson, documenting Emma's planned route, her expected timeline, and any unusual circumstances that might be relevant to her disappearance. The deputy was struck by the family's obvious close relationships and Emma's reputation as a responsible young woman who wouldn't disappear voluntarily. "Emma's not the type to take off without telling anyone," Carol Richardson told the deputy, her voice steady despite her obvious fear. "She's been talking about her future on this ranch, about taking over the operation someday. This place means everything to her. She wouldn't just leave." Stevens also documented the family's attempts to locate Emma, including Jim's drive to town and their unsuccessful attempts to reach her by phone. The deputy noted that the Richardsons had followed proper procedures for a missing person situation, waiting a reasonable amount of time before calling for help but not so long as to jeopardize Emma's safety if she was injured or stranded. By dawn on September 13, 2009, the search for Emma Richardson had begun in earnest. Sheriff Robert Wagner activated the county's volunteer search and rescue team and requested assistance from neighboring agencies. The Montana Highway Patrol provided helicopter support, while volunteer fire departments from 3 counties offered ground teams and equipment. The response was typical of rural Montana communities, where neighbors helped neighbors without question and where the disappearance of a local young woman was everyone's concern. Within hours, over 100 volunteers had assembled at the Richardson Ranch, organizing into search teams and coordinating their efforts with professional law enforcement personnel. The search strategy focused on the 30-mile corridor between the Richardson Ranch and Livingston, with particular attention to areas where a vehicle might leave the road undetected. The terrain presented unique challenges. While much of the route passed through open country where a crash should be visible, there were also numerous ravines, creek beds, and stands of trees where a vehicle could be hidden from view. The volunteer effort was coordinated by Janet Mills, a retired nurse who had organized numerous community events over the years. Mills set up a command post at the ranch house, maintaining communication with search teams and ensuring that all areas were systematically covered. Her organizational skills and calm demeanor helped maintain focus and efficiency during the emotionally charged first days of the search. "We had people coming from all over the county to help," Mills recalled years later. "Ranchers, townspeople, retirees, high school kids, it didn't matter who you were or what you did for a living. Emma was one of ours, and we were going to find her." Search teams combed every mile of the highway and the secondary roads that branched off from it. They checked abandoned homesteads, old mining claims, and the remnants of ghost towns that dotted the landscape, reminders of Montana's boom and bust history. Volunteers on horseback covered areas inaccessible to vehicles, while ATVs searched the creek bottoms and coulees that could hide a crashed vehicle. The ghost towns that gave Montana much of its character also complicated the search effort. Places like Aldridge, Electric, and Jardine, once thriving mining communities that had been abandoned when the ore played out, offered countless hiding places for evidence or even a missing person. Each abandoned building had to be checked, each mine shaft explored, each forgotten cellar investigated. These ghost towns were more than just historical curiosities, they were reminders of the boom and bust cycles that had shaped Montana's development. Gold rushes, railroad construction, and mining booms had brought waves of settlers to the territory, but economic downturns and resource depletion had just as quickly emptied many communities, leaving behind only weathered buildings and rusted machinery as testaments to vanished dreams. The railroad history of Montana also played a role in the search effort. The old Great Northern Railway line that had connected the region to national markets in the early 1900s had left behind a network of abandoned rights-of-way, trestle bridges, and maintenance buildings. These linear corridors through the landscape had to be searched systematically, as they offered both potential hiding places and possible routes that a disoriented person might follow. The helicopter proved invaluable in covering the vast territory quickly, but even from the air, the landscape's immensity was overwhelming. Pilot Tom Bradley, a 20-year veteran of search and rescue operations, described the challenge. "It's like looking for a needle in a haystack the size of several counties. A vehicle could be out there completely hidden in a drawer or behind a hill, and you might fly right over it without seeing it." The search effort revealed both the strengths and limitations of rural communities in crisis situations. The response from volunteers was overwhelming and heartwarming, demonstrating the strong social bonds that characterized small-town Montana life. But the vast distances and challenging terrain made it impossible to search everywhere quickly, and the limited resources of rural law enforcement agencies became apparent as the effort stretched on. On the second day of the search, teams discovered Emma's cell phone along the highway shoulder about 15 miles from the ranch. The phone was badly damaged, as if it had been thrown from a moving vehicle, and its battery was completely dead. The discovery shifted the focus of the investigation from a possible accident to a potential crime. The location where the phone was found became a crucial piece of evidence. The device was discovered in a shallow ditch beside State Highway 89, partially hidden under some prairie grass but visible to the trained eye of a search team member who was specifically looking for small items that might have been overlooked by passing motorists. The phone's condition told a story that investigators found deeply troubling. The screen was shattered, the plastic casing was cracked, and there were scrape marks that suggested it had been dragged along asphalt before coming to rest in the ditch. Most significantly, the damage pattern was inconsistent with the phone simply falling from a vehicle or being dropped accidentally. The phone looked like it had been deliberately destroyed, Sheriff Wagner explained to the Richardson family during one of his regular updates. The damage suggests it was thrown from a moving vehicle with considerable force, possibly in an attempt to prevent it from being used to track Emma's location. The area around where the phone was found became a crime scene. Montana's Division of Criminal Investigation sent forensic technicians to process the location, looking for tire tracks, footprints, or any other evidence that might explain what had happened to Emma. The phone itself was sent to the state crime lab for analysis, though the extensive damage made data recovery unlikely. The forensic team spent hours meticulously documenting the scene, photographing the phone's position, measuring distances to nearby landmarks, and collecting soil samples that might contain trace evidence. They also took detailed photographs of the highway surface, looking for skid marks or other signs that a vehicle had stopped or turned around at that location. Despite their thorough efforts, the scene yielded little additional evidence. The asphalt surface of the highway didn't hold tire impressions well, and the dry conditions meant that there were no clear footprints in the hard-packed soil beside the road. The investigation team was left with more questions than answers about what had happened at that spot on the night Emma disappeared. As the search entered its third day, the Montana weather began to assert itself with the sudden severity that could characterize early autumn in the high country. A cold front moved in from the northwest, bringing with it the kind of early snow that reminded everyone that winter in Montana could arrive without warning and stay for months. The temperature dropped into the 20s overnight, and snow began to accumulate on the higher elevations surrounding the search area. The dramatic weather change added urgency to the search effort and highlighted one of the harsh realities of life in Montana: the climate could be as dangerous as any human threat. If Emma was injured and stranded somewhere in the vast Montana wilderness, the approaching winter conditions would quickly become life-threatening. Hypothermia could kill in hours under the right conditions, and the snow would make searching even more difficult by obscuring potential evidence and making many areas inaccessible to search teams. The Richardson family watched the weather with growing desperation. They had lived in Montana long enough to understand the implications of an early winter storm, and they knew that Emma's chances of survival decreased dramatically with each degree the temperature dropped. Carol Richardson made emotional appeals on local television, her voice breaking as she pleaded for anyone with information to come forward. "Emma is a strong girl who knows this country better than most," she said, tears streaming down her weathered face. "But she's been gone 3 days now, and this weather is getting dangerous. Please, if anyone saw anything at all, call the sheriff's office. We just want to bring our daughter home." The television coverage brought an outpouring of community support that exemplified the best qualities of rural Montana life. Ranchers and townspeople who had never met the Richardsons volunteered for the search effort, donating their time, equipment, and expertise to the cause. Local churches organized prayer vigils, and businesses donated food and supplies for the search teams. The response also attracted volunteers from unexpected places. Word of Emma's disappearance spread through the tight-knit networks of the Montana ranching community, bringing helpers from as far away as Miles City and Great Falls. Some were retired law enforcement officers who offered their expertise, while others were simply concerned citizens who felt compelled to help in any way they could. Among the volunteers who stepped forward was Tom Henley, a 45-year-old ranch hand who worked for several properties in the area. Henley had moved to Montana from Colorado about 12 years earlier, following a divorce that had left him seeking a fresh start in a place where he could work with his hands and live a simple life close to nature. Henley was well regarded in the community as a skilled and reliable worker. He was known for his ability to handle difficult horses, his expertise in fence construction and repair, and his willingness to take on the kind of hard, dirty jobs that many ranch hands preferred to avoid. He lived alone in a modest trailer home on the outskirts of a small community and was generally described as quiet but friendly. Tom was always one of the first to volunteer when someone needed help, remembered Janet Mills, who coordinated volunteers at the search command post. He knew every back road and cattle trail in the county better than most people who'd lived here their whole lives. If anyone could find Emma, we thought it would be Tom. Henley's knowledge of the local terrain made him particularly valuable to the search effort. He organized his own teams of volunteers, focusing on remote areas that the official search might have missed or been unable to access with standard vehicles. His groups used horses and ATVs to reach isolated canyons and high country areas that would have been impossible to search on foot. What impressed other volunteers most about Henley was his dedication and stamina. He spent 12 to 14 hours a day in the field, often working alone when other volunteers had gone home to rest. He seemed to have an inexhaustible energy for the search and an intimate knowledge of places where someone might hide a vehicle or dispose of evidence. Tom knew places that weren't on any map, recalled Mike Santos, a local rancher who worked with Henley during the search. Old mining roads, forgotten homesteads, canyons that most people had never seen. He'd been all over this country working different ranches, and he remembered every trail and every hiding place. Henley's apparent dedication to finding Emma impressed the Richardson family, who were grateful for any help they could get. Carol Richardson later remembered him as a godsend during our darkest hours, someone who seemed to share their pain and determination to find their daughter. What none of the volunteers or the Richardson family knew was that Tom Henley was harboring a terrible secret. His helpful demeanor and intimate knowledge of the search area came from a source darker than anyone could imagine. His dedication to the search effort wasn't motivated by community spirit or concern for Emma's welfare, but by a desperate need to monitor the investigation and ensure that searchers never got close to discovering what he had done. As the official search entered its second week, the focus began to shift toward the possibility that Emma Richardson was the victim of foul play. The discovery of her damaged cell phone, combined with the complete absence of any trace of her or the truck despite extensive searching, suggested that this was not a simple accident or case of someone getting lost in the wilderness. Detective Linda Harris from the Montana Division of Criminal Investigation was assigned to lead the criminal investigation. Harris was a 15-year veteran with experience in complex cases involving missing persons and potential homicides. She had worked cases throughout Montana and understood the unique challenges presented by the state's vast distances and sparse population. The geography works against us in a case like this, Harris explained to the Richardson family during one of her regular updates. In a city, someone can't just disappear without leaving some kind of trail, witnesses, security cameras, electronic records. But out here, with all this open country and so few people around, it's like the landscape itself is working to hide evidence. Harris began the methodical process of investigating Emma's life, looking for any indication of who might want to harm her or why she might have disappeared voluntarily. The investigation quickly revealed that Emma was exactly what she appeared to be, a hardworking, well-liked young woman with no enemies and no reason to disappear on her own. Emma's friends and family described her as someone who was deeply committed to the family ranch and to rural Montana life. She had briefly dated a few local men but had no serious romantic relationships at the time of her disappearance. Her social circle was small and close-knit, consisting mainly of other ranch families and people involved in the agricultural community. Emma wasn't the type to have secrets or get involved in anything dangerous, said her best friend Maria Santos, who had known her since high school. She was completely focused on the ranch and on building a future here in Montana. If she had been having problems with someone or thinking about leaving, she would have told me. The investigation expanded to include everyone who might have had contact with Emma on the day she disappeared. This included the ranch hands and neighbors who had seen her during the day, as well as anyone who might have been traveling the same route toward Livingston that evening. The process of interviewing potential witnesses revealed the tight-knit nature of the rural Montana community. Everyone seemed to know everyone else, and the Richardsons were well-regarded neighbors who had helped others during difficult times. The idea that someone would harm Emma was almost incomprehensible to most people, which made the investigation more challenging but also more important. One name that came up repeatedly during these interviews was Tom Henley. Several people mentioned that Henley had worked occasional jobs at the Richardson Ranch over the past year, helping with branding, roundup activities, and fence construction. He was described as a reliable worker, though somewhat quiet and reserved around the family. When Detective Harris interviewed Henley about his knowledge of Emma and the Richardson family, he seemed cooperative but nervous. He claimed to barely know Emma personally, saying that most of his interactions had been with her father and the other ranch hands during the work projects he had been hired for. "I worked a few days here and there at that place over the past year," Henley told Harris during their first interview. "Nice family, real hard workers. But I didn't really interact with the daughter much. She usually had her own jobs to do while I was working on fences or helping with cattle." Henley's account of his whereabouts on the evening of September 12 was vague and somewhat inconsistent. He claimed to have been at his trailer home, about 20 miles from the Richardson Ranch, watching television and drinking beer. He said he had cooked dinner for himself and spent the evening alone, which was typical for him since he didn't socialize much. When pressed for details about what he had watched on television or done during the evening, Henley's responses were fuzzy and contradictory. He mentioned watching a football game but couldn't remember which teams were playing or what the score had been. He said he had gone to bed early but couldn't specify exactly when. Harris noted Henley's nervous demeanor during the interview and the inconsistencies in his story, but without any physical evidence or witnesses placing him at the scene, there was nothing to justify treating him as a suspect. His participation in the search efforts actually worked in his favor, creating the impression of someone genuinely concerned about finding Emma. The detective also noted that Henley lived alone and had no close relationships that could verify his whereabouts on the night in question. This was not unusual in rural Montana, where many ranch hands lived solitary lives and had few social connections outside of work. But it also meant that his alibi was essentially unverifiable. As autumn progressed into winter, the search for Emma Richardson gradually wound down. The early snow had given way to the kind of brutal cold that Montana was famous for, with temperatures dropping to 30 below zero and staying there for weeks at a time. The landscape became virtually impassable except by snowmobile, and the chances of finding Emma alive dropped to virtually zero. The search teams had covered thousands of square miles of Montana wilderness, checking every abandoned building, mine shaft, and remote canyon they could access. Volunteers had walked countless miles of rough terrain, searched hundreds of potential hiding places, and followed up on dozens of tips and reported sightings. Despite their heroic efforts, they had found no trace of Emma or her truck beyond the damaged cell phone. The case officially remained an active investigation, but with no new leads and no evidence to pursue, it effectively became a cold case. Detective Harris periodically reviewed the file and followed up on tips that came in, but as the years passed, those tips became fewer and less credible. The Richardson family struggled to cope with the uncertainty and the lack of closure. Without a body or any definitive evidence of what had happened to Emma, they couldn't grieve properly or find peace. The not knowing was perhaps the cruelest aspect of their ordeal, the constant wondering whether Emma might still be alive somewhere, whether she was suffering, whether they should hope or despair. Carol Richardson became obsessed with keeping the case in the public eye, giving interviews to any media outlet that would listen and maintaining a Facebook page dedicated to finding Emma. She organized annual memorial events and never missed an opportunity to remind people that her daughter was still missing and that someone, somewhere, might have information that could solve the case. Not knowing is the worst part, Carol told a reporter on the 5th anniversary of Emma's disappearance. "Every day I wake up wondering if this will be the day we find out what happened to her. I can't move on because there's always that tiny chance she might still be out there somewhere, waiting for us to find her." Jim Richardson dealt with his grief differently, throwing himself into the work of the ranch with an intensity that worried his family and friends. He rarely spoke about Emma's disappearance, but those who knew him could see the toll it was taking. The jovial, outgoing man who had welcomed neighbors and visitors to the ranch became withdrawn and suspicious, as if he no longer trusted the world beyond his property line. The impact of Emma's disappearance extended far beyond the Richardson family. The close-knit ranching community had been shaken by the realization that someone could simply vanish from their midst without explanation. Parents began keeping closer track of their children, and the easy trust that had characterized rural Montana life became tempered with wariness and suspicion. Local businesses that depended on the agricultural community felt the effects as well. The annual roundup celebrations and community gatherings that had brought ranching families together for generations became smaller and more subdued. The shadow of Emma's disappearance hung over every gathering, a reminder that their safe, isolated world might not be as secure as they had believed. Tom Henley continued to live and work in Park County, maintaining his reputation as a reliable ranch hand and helpful neighbor. He occasionally participated in anniversary searches for Emma, always expressing hope that she would be found and justice would be served. To his neighbors and employers, he seemed genuinely affected by the tragedy, often bringing up the case in conversations and speculating about what might have happened. Henley's continued presence in the community and his apparent concern for the case actually helped deflect suspicion from him. People who might have wondered about his nervous behavior during the initial investigation saw his ongoing involvement in search efforts as evidence of his innocence. His knowledge of remote areas and his willingness to search them was seen as helpful rather than suspicious. What no one suspected was that Henley's interest in the case and his intimate knowledge of the search areas came from his direct involvement in Emma's disappearance. For 15 years, he carried the secret of what had happened on that September evening in 2009, all while maintaining the facade of a concerned community member who desperately wanted to see the case solved. The breakthrough in Emma Richardson's case came not from traditional detective work or new witness testimony, but from the revolutionary field of forensic genetic genealogy. In early 2024, the Montana Department of Justice announced a new initiative to review cold cases using advanced DNA analysis techniques that had not been available when the original investigations were conducted. The initiative was part of a broader national movement to use cutting-edge forensic science to solve cold cases that had stymied investigators for years or even decades. States across the country were reviewing their unsolved cases, looking for biological evidence that could be reanalyzed using techniques that had been developed in the years since the original investigations. Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic geneticist with the Montana State Crime Lab, was assigned to review the Emma Richardson case among dozens of others. The case file contained several pieces of potential evidence that had been preserved but never fully analyzed due to technological limitations at the time of Emma's disappearance. In 2009, our DNA analysis capabilities were much more limited than they are today, Dr. Chen explained to the investigative team. We could work with good quality samples that contained substantial amounts of biological material, but degraded or mixed samples were often unusable. Advances in extraction and amplification techniques now allow us to work with evidence that would have been considered worthless 15 years ago. The evidence in Emma's case included several items that had been collected during the original search and investigation. These included strands of hair that had been caught on barbed wire near where her cell phone was discovered, a partial fingerprint on the phone itself, and traces of foreign DNA that had been found on the phone's surface. In 2009, none of these samples had yielded usable profiles for comparison. The hair samples were particularly promising for modern analysis techniques. While the original testing had been unable to extract sufficient DNA for comparison, advances in mitochondrial DNA analysis and improved extraction methods meant that even severely degraded samples could now yield usable genetic profiles. Using modern extraction techniques and advanced amplification methods, Dr. Chen's team was able to develop a partial DNA profile from the hair samples. The profile was incomplete, containing only about 60% of the genetic markers needed for a definitive match, but it contained enough information for forensic genetic genealogy analysis. The partial DNA profile was uploaded to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database where millions of Americans have voluntarily shared their genetic information to trace family history and find relatives. The database had grown exponentially since 2009, providing a much larger pool of potential genetic matches than would have been available during the original investigation. Within hours of uploading the profile, the system identified several potential distant relatives of the unknown DNA contributor. The matches were not close enough for direct identification, they indicated relationships at the level of third or fourth cousins, but they provided starting points for building family trees that could eventually lead to a suspect. Working with professional genealogists who specialized in law enforcement applications, Dr. Chen's team began the painstaking process of building family trees from the genetic matches. The work required accessing historical records, census data, birth and death certificates, immigration records, and marriage licenses to trace family lines back several generations. The process was both an art and a science, requiring not only technical expertise in genetics but also detective skills in historical research. The genealogists had to identify common ancestors among the genetic matches, then trace all possible descendant lines forward through time to identify potential suspects who would have been the right age and in the right location in 2009. The work took several months of careful analysis, with the team methodically eliminating potential suspects who could be ruled out through documentation of their whereabouts, death records, or other factors. The investigation gradually narrowed to a specific family line that had immigrated to Montana from Scandinavia in the early 1900s and settled in the south-central part of the state. Further research identified 3 men from this lineage who would have been the right age to be suspects in 2009 and who had some connection to the Park County area. The genealogical analysis had provided investigators with specific names and biographical information about each potential suspect, giving them clear targets for further investigation. 2 of the potential suspects were quickly eliminated through conventional investigative methods. The first had died in a farming accident in 2015, and investigators were able to obtain DNA samples from his surviving family members that excluded him as the source of the genetic material from Emma's case. The second had been serving time in federal prison during 2009 for unrelated charges, providing an unshakable alibi. The third name on the list sent shockwaves through the investigative team, Thomas "Tom" Henley. The realization that Tom Henley might be connected to Emma Richardson's disappearance through DNA evidence transformed the investigation from a cold case review into an active criminal inquiry. Detective Harris, now a lieutenant with the Montana Division of Criminal Investigation, was brought back to lead the renewed investigation into the case that had haunted her for 15 years. When I saw Tom's name come up from the genetic genealogy analysis, everything clicked into place, Harris recalled. His behavior during the original investigation, his intimate knowledge of the search area, his insistence on being involved in every aspect of the search effort, it all made sense once we considered him as a suspect rather than a helpful volunteer. Harris immediately began reviewing Henley's background and activities since 2009, looking for any additional evidence that might support the genetic findings. What she discovered was a pattern of behavior that raised serious red flags about his potential involvement in other crimes. Over the 15 years since Emma's disappearance, Henley had been involved in several incidents that had raised suspicions among local law enforcement. He had been questioned in connection with livestock thefts, had been reported for trespassing on private property, and had been the subject of complaints from female ranch hands who found his behavior unsettling. None of these incidents had resulted in charges, partly because of the rural Montana culture of handling minor disputes informally and partly because Henley was skilled at presenting himself as a misunderstood loner rather than a potential threat. But taken together, they suggested a pattern of boundary-crossing behavior that was consistent with someone capable of more serious crimes. Harris also discovered that Henley had left Montana briefly in 2018, moving to Wyoming for about 6 months before returning to Park County. During his absence, there had been no reports of missing women or suspicious incidents in the area, but his return had coincided with several reports of prowling and trespassing incidents that had never been solved. The investigative team faced the challenge of confirming the genetic genealogy findings with a direct DNA sample from Henley. They needed to accomplish this without alerting him to the renewed investigation, as he had remained in the area and could potentially flee or destroy evidence if he suspected he was under scrutiny. Surveillance operations in rural Montana presented unique challenges. The sparse population and vast distances meant that any unfamiliar vehicles or people would be quickly noticed and reported. The investigative team had to develop a surveillance plan that would allow them to monitor Henley without arousing suspicion in the tight-knit community where he lived and worked. The solution was to establish a long-term surveillance operation using undercover officers posing as hunters and outdoor enthusiasts. Montana's reputation as a destination for hunting and fishing provided perfect cover for law enforcement personnel to move through the area without attracting attention. Surveillance revealed that Henley, now 60 years old, was still working as a ranch hand in Park County, living in the same trailer where he had been in 2009. He had never married and maintained few close relationships, fitting the profile of someone who could harbor such a terrible secret for 15 years without anyone becoming suspicious. The surveillance team noted several concerning patterns in Henley's behavior. He frequently drove long distances into remote areas of the county, often staying out overnight with camping gear. While this could have been innocent recreation, the investigators couldn't help but wonder if he was revisiting locations connected to his crimes or scouting new areas where evidence might be hidden. Henley also displayed signs of paranoia and hypervigilance that suggested he might be aware he was being watched. He frequently checked his rear-view mirror while driving, took circuitous routes to common destinations, and seemed to be constantly scanning his environment for threats or surveillance. The opportunity to collect a DNA sample came when Henley stopped at a convenience store in Livingston for coffee and a breakfast sandwich. The store was busy with morning customers, providing good cover for surveillance officers to position themselves nearby without being obvious. Surveillance officers watched as Henley consumed his meal outside the store, sitting on a picnic table in the parking lot while reading a local newspaper. When he finished eating and drinking, he discarded his coffee cup and food wrapper in a public trash container and drove away. The discarded items were immediately retrieved by surveillance officers and transported under strict chain-of-custody procedures to the Montana State Crime Lab for analysis. The team was careful to document every step of the collection process to ensure that any resulting evidence would be admissible in court. Within 48 hours, Dr. Chen's team had extracted a complete DNA profile from saliva residue on the coffee cup rim. The comparison with the genetic material from Emma Richardson's case was definitive and unambiguous. Tom Henley was the source of the DNA found at the scene of her disappearance. The confirmation of Henley's DNA match opened the door for a comprehensive investigation into his activities in 2009 and his potential involvement in other unsolved cases. Investigators obtained search warrants for his residence, vehicles, and any storage units or other properties he might have access to. The search of Henley's trailer home revealed a disturbing collection of items that suggested an obsession with the Emma Richardson case. Hidden in a locked storage box, investigators found newspaper clippings about Emma's disappearance, photographs from the search efforts, and detailed maps of the areas that had been searched. Most chilling of all, they found a journal containing Henley's thoughts and observations about the investigation. The journal entries revealed a man who took perverse pleasure in watching the Richardson family's suffering and who saw himself as intellectually superior to the law enforcement officers investigating the case. He had documented his participation in search efforts not as genuine attempts to help, but as opportunities to gather intelligence about the investigation and to ensure that searchers never got close to discovering evidence. Reading those journal entries was one of the most disturbing experiences of my career, Lieutenant Harris later recalled. Here was a man who had not only committed a terrible crime, but who had spent years gloating about it and enjoying the pain he had caused. It showed a level of psychological cruelty that went far beyond the original crime. The arrest of Tom Henley took place at dawn on August 15, 2024, nearly 15 years to the day after Emma Richardson had vanished. A coordinated team of Montana Highway Patrol officers, Division of Criminal Investigation agents, and FBI personnel surrounded his trailer home in a carefully planned operation designed to prevent any possibility of escape or resistance. Henley answered the door in his work clothes, apparently preparing to leave for another day of ranch work. His reaction to seeing the officers was immediate and telling. Rather than the confusion or surprise that an innocent person might show, his shoulders sagged in what appeared to be resignation mixed with relief. "Tom Henley, you're under arrest for the murder of Emma Richardson," Lieutenant Harris announced, her voice steady despite the emotion she felt at finally making this arrest. As officers placed Henley in handcuffs and read him his rights, Harris couldn't help but think about all the years the Richardson family had suffered while this man lived freely among them. The charges against Henley included deliberate homicide, aggravated kidnapping, and tampering with evidence, crimes that carried the possibility of life in prison or even the death penalty under Montana law. The arrest warrant also authorized the seizure of his vehicle, personal belongings, and any other evidence that might be relevant to the case. News of Henley's arrest spread rapidly through the tight-knit communities of Park County and beyond. For many who had known him over the years, the revelation was shocking and incomprehensible. Here was a man who had been part of the search for Emma, who had expressed concern for her family, who had lived among them for years without raising serious suspicion. "It's like finding out that someone you've known for years is a complete stranger," said Janet Mills, who had coordinated volunteers during the original search. "Tom was there every day, helping us organize search teams, suggesting areas to check, acting like he cared as much as any of us about finding Emma. To think that he knew exactly what had happened to her while he was pretending to help, it's beyond disturbing." The Richardson family received the news of Henley's arrest at their ranch, where they had gathered for one of their periodic memorial services for Emma. Lieutenant Harris delivered the news personally, wanting to ensure they heard it from law enforcement rather than from media reports that might sensationalize or distort the facts. Carol Richardson's reaction was a complex mixture of relief, vindication, and renewed anguish. "I'm grateful that we finally have answers," she told reporters later that day, her voice shaking with emotion. "But knowing that the person who took Emma from us was someone who looked us in the eye and pretended to care about finding her, that makes the betrayal even worse than we could have imagined." Jim Richardson was more direct in his response, his years of suppressed anger finally finding expression. "For 15 years, that man sat at our kitchen table, ate our food, and listened to us talk about how much we missed Emma. He was at her memorial services. He helped us search for our daughter while knowing exactly what he had done to her. There's no punishment severe enough for what has put our family through." 3 days after his arrest, Tom Henley agreed to speak with investigators. In a small interview room at the Yellowstone County Detention Facility in Billings, he faced Lieutenant Harris and other members of the investigative team for what would prove to be a confession that finally revealed the truth about Emma Richardson's fate. The confession was unlike anything the experienced investigators had heard before. Rather than showing remorse or trying to minimize his actions, Henley spoke about Emma's murder with a detached, almost clinical demeanor that suggested he had rehearsed this moment many times in his mind. Henley's confession began with an admission that he had been obsessed with Emma Richardson for months before her disappearance. He described watching her during his work at the ranch, fantasizing about having power over her, and planning how he might get her alone without arousing suspicion. "I had been thinking about Emma for a long time before that night," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "She represented everything I couldn't have: youth, beauty, a secure place in the community. I wanted to possess that, to have power over it, to take it away from her." Henley described the events of September 12, 2009, with disturbing clarity and detail. He had not encountered Emma by chance, as he initially claimed, but had been waiting for her along the route to Livingston, knowing from his work at the ranch that she would be making the trip alone that evening. "I knew her routines, knew she often went to town by herself in the evenings," he continued. "I parked my truck in a spot where I could see the road and waited for her to come by. When I saw her truck approaching, I pulled out in front of her and forced her to stop." The confrontation that followed was not the result of sudden impulse or temporary madness, but the execution of a plan that Henley had been developing for weeks. He had brought zip ties, duct tape, and a handgun, indicating premeditation and preparation for violence. "She tried to reason with me at first," Henley recalled with what seemed like satisfaction. "She said she would give me money, said she wouldn't tell anyone what happened if I just let her go. But I wasn't interested in money or in letting her go. I had waited too long for this opportunity." Henley forced Emma at gunpoint to drive her own truck to a remote location he had scouted in advance, an abandoned homestead in a canyon several miles from the highway. The location was chosen specifically because it was isolated, inaccessible to casual visitors, and unlikely to be discovered even by extensive search efforts. The details of what happened at the abandoned homestead were too disturbing for investigators to release publicly, but Henley's confession made clear that Emma had fought bravely for her life before succumbing to her injuries. He described her final moments with a coldness that chilled everyone who heard the recording. "She was stronger than I expected," he said matter-of-factly. "She almost got away twice, but I was prepared for that. I had planned for every possibility." After killing Emma, Henley had methodically disposed of evidence and staged the scene to mislead investigators. He buried her body in a carefully chosen location within the abandoned homestead complex, then drove her truck to an even more remote area where he concealed it in an abandoned mine shaft. The damaged cell phone that had been found along the highway was not evidence of a struggle at that location, but part of Henley's deliberate deception. He had taken the phone from Emma's truck and thrown it from his vehicle while driving back from the murder scene, hoping to create a false trail that would lead investigators away from the actual crime location. "I wanted to give the police something to find," he explained. "I knew they would search along the highway if they found the phone there, and that would keep them busy while I made sure the real evidence was properly hidden." Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Henley's confession was his description of joining the search efforts while knowing exactly what had happened to Emma. He had volunteered not out of genuine concern or guilt, but to monitor the investigation and ensure that searchers never got close to discovering the truth. "I needed to know what the police were thinking, where they were planning to search," he said. "The best way to do that was to be part of the search myself. And I have to admit, there was something satisfying about being there when her family was suffering, knowing that I was the cause of their pain and that they had no idea." This admission of psychological sadism was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire confession. It revealed Henley not as someone who had committed a crime of passion or opportunity, but as a calculating predator who had taken pleasure in the prolonged suffering of his victim's family. Armed with Tom Henley's detailed confession, law enforcement teams set out to recover Emma Richardson's remains and gather the physical evidence that would support the prosecution's case. The location Henley described was indeed remote, a rugged canyon in the Absaroka Mountains that required four-wheel drive vehicles and serious hiking to access. The recovery team included forensic anthropologists from the University of Montana, FBI evidence specialists, and investigators from multiple agencies. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the forensic anthropologist leading the recovery, had worked on numerous cases involving remains in harsh environmental conditions, but the Montana wilderness presented unique challenges. 15 years in this climate, with freeze-thaw cycles, wildlife activity, and natural erosion, can scatter and damage remains significantly, Dr. Martinez explained to the team before beginning the search. "We need to approach this methodically and be prepared to search a much wider area than the initial burial site." On August 22, 2024, searchers located the abandoned homestead that Henley had described in his confession. The site consisted of the foundation and partial walls of a farmhouse that had been built sometime in the early 1900s and abandoned during the Depression era. It was exactly the kind of forgotten place that dotted the Montana landscape, a reminder of dreams that had failed to survive the harsh realities of frontier life. The homestead was located in a narrow canyon that was accessible only by a faint trail that wound through dense forest and rocky terrain. The isolation was complete. Even during hunting season, the location was unlikely to attract visitors due to its difficult access and the presence of several other, more accessible hunting areas nearby. Using ground-penetrating radar and careful excavation techniques, the team located human remains buried behind the collapsed barn. The burial was shallow and had been disturbed by wildlife over the years, but enough remained for positive identification through DNA analysis and dental records. Along with Emma's skeletal remains, investigators found personal items that confirmed her identity and told the story of her final hours. These included a distinctive turquoise bracelet that her family immediately recognized, the remains of her work boots, fragments of the clothing she had been wearing on the day she disappeared, and heartbreakingly, the engagement ring she had been planning to give to a boyfriend when the right time came. The recovery process took 3 days, with investigators meticulously documenting and photographing every piece of evidence. The careful excavation revealed additional evidence of the violence that had been committed at the site, including zip ties that had been used to restrain Emma and other items that corroborated Henley's confession. The discovery provided the final piece of evidence needed for prosecution, but it also gave the Richardson family something they had desperately needed for 15 years, the ability to bring Emma home and lay her to rest with dignity and finality. The recovery team also located Emma's truck at the abandoned mine shaft that Henley had described. The 2005 Silverado had been deliberately concealed under branches and debris, but 15 years of weather had taken their toll. The vehicle was carefully extracted and transported to the state crime lab for forensic analysis, though investigators expected little additional evidence after so much time. On September 12, 2024, exactly 15 years after her disappearance, Emma Richardson was finally laid to rest in the Livingston Cemetery. The funeral drew hundreds of mourners from across Montana, including many who had participated in the original search efforts and had never forgotten the young woman who had vanished from their community. The service was held at the Livingston Methodist Church, where the Richardson family had worshipped for generations. Pastor William Hayes, who had known Emma since childhood and had conducted memorial services for her over the years, delivered a eulogy that captured both the tragedy of her death and the strength she had shown throughout her life. Emma Richardson was a daughter of Montana in every sense, Pastor Hayes said, his voice carrying across the packed church. She loved this land, this way of life, and these people with a pure heart. The evil that took her from us could not diminish the light she brought to everyone who knew her. Today we commit her body to the earth she loved, knowing that her spirit has already found the peace that was stolen from her here. The Richardson family used the occasion to announce the establishment of the Emma Richardson Memorial Scholarship for students from rural Montana communities pursuing agricultural education. The scholarship would help young people like Emma continue their education while staying connected to the ranching life she had loved so much. Emma's dream was to modernize ranch management while preserving our traditions, Carol Richardson explained during the announcement. This scholarship will help other young people pursue that same vision. Every year, when we award this scholarship, Emma's dreams will live on through others who share her passion for the land and for ranching. Tom Henley's trial began in February 2025, drawing national attention as a landmark case demonstrating how advanced forensic techniques could solve even decades-old crimes. The case was prosecuted by the Montana Attorney General's office, with District Attorney Michael Thompson leading a team of experienced prosecutors who specialized in major crimes. The evidence against Henley was overwhelming and multifaceted: his detailed confession, the DNA evidence linking him to the scene, the recovery of Emma's remains from the exact location he had described, and the disturbing journal entries that revealed his psychological state before, during, and after the crime. The defense, led by court-appointed attorney Sarah Williams, faced the nearly impossible task of defending a client who had confessed to his crimes in explicit detail and whose guilt was supported by irrefutable physical evidence. Williams attempted to argue for a sentence of life imprisonment rather than the death penalty, emphasizing Henley's cooperation with investigators and his lack of prior violent convictions. However, the calculated nature of the crime, the evidence of premeditation, and Henley's behavior during the 15 years following Emma's murder made it difficult to generate any sympathy for the defendant. The prosecution presented evidence that Henley had essentially tormented the Richardson family for 15 years by participating in their grief while knowing he was the cause of their suffering. The most powerful testimony came from the Richardson family themselves. Carol Richardson's victim impact statement was delivered with quiet dignity but devastating emotional impact as she described 15 years of not knowing what had happened to her daughter. Tom Henley didn't just kill Emma that night in 2009, she testified. He killed a part of our entire family. For 15 years, we lived in limbo, not knowing if she was suffering somewhere, not knowing if we should hope or grieve. He sat at our table and listened to our pain while knowing he was the cause of it. That level of cruelty goes beyond the original crime and shows a depth of evil that I never imagined could exist in another human being. Jim Richardson's testimony was more direct and filled with barely controlled anger. This man looked me in the eye for 15 years and lied. He helped us search for our daughter while knowing exactly what he had done to her. He attended her memorial services and pretended to mourn with us. He deserves whatever punishment this court can give him, and I hope he spends every remaining day of his life thinking about what he took from our family. Expert witnesses testified about the genetic genealogy techniques that had finally solved the case, explaining to the jury how advances in forensic science could bring justice even decades after a crime was committed. Dr. Sarah Chen's testimony was particularly compelling as she described the painstaking process of extracting usable DNA from degraded evidence and building family trees to identify suspects. The trial also featured testimony from forensic anthropologists about the condition of Emma's remains and what they revealed about her final hours. While the testimony was technical and clinical, its emotional impact on the jury was evident as several members appeared visibly affected by the details of Emma's suffering. On March 10, 2025, after 3 weeks of testimony and evidence presentation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all charges after deliberating for less than 3 hours. The speed of the deliberation reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence against Henley and the clear premeditation that had characterized his crimes. Judge Robert Anderson scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later, giving both sides time to prepare their arguments for the appropriate punishment. While Montana retained the death penalty for the most serious crimes, the prosecution had indicated they would seek life imprisonment without the possibility of parole rather than execution. During the sentencing hearing, Judge Anderson allowed additional victim impact statements from community members who had been affected by Emma's disappearance and Henley's deception. The statements painted a picture of a crime that had damaged not just the Richardson family, but an entire rural community that had lost its sense of safety and trust. Mr. Henley, you have shown yourself to be a predator who took pleasure not just in committing murder, but in the prolonged suffering of your victim's family and community, Judge Anderson said during sentencing. You have demonstrated a level of cruelty and calculation that goes far beyond the typical criminal defendant. You will spend the rest of your life in prison, which is appropriate given the magnitude of your crimes and your behavior afterward. The resolution of Emma Richardson's case had implications that extended far beyond the courtroom in Billings. It became a landmark case demonstrating how genetic genealogy could solve cold cases that had seemed hopeless, leading to renewed efforts to review other unsolved crimes across Montana and throughout the nation. The case also highlighted the unique challenges of law enforcement in rural areas like Montana, where vast distances and sparse populations could make it easy for criminals to hide in plain sight for years or even decades. Henley had lived and worked in the same small community for decades, trusted by his neighbors and employers, while harboring one of the darkest secrets imaginable. Today, visitors to Park County can still see the abandoned homesteads and ghost towns that dot the Montana landscape, reminders of the state's complex history of boom and bust, dreams and failures. But Emma Richardson's story has added a new chapter to that history, a reminder that even in the most remote and seemingly safe places, evil can hide among the most trusted members of the community. The Emma Richardson Memorial Scholarship continues to help young people from rural Montana pursue their dreams of working in agriculture while staying connected to the land they love. Recipients often visit Emma's grave in Livingston Cemetery before beginning their studies, drawing inspiration from a young woman who embodied the best qualities of rural Montana life and whose memory continues to make a positive difference in the world. In the end, Emma Richardson's legacy lives on not just in the scholarship that bears her name or the investigative techniques that found her killer, but in the reminder that justice, though sometimes delayed, will eventually find its way through even the vastest landscapes and the most carefully guarded secrets. Her story became part of Montana's enduring narrative, a testament to the persistence of love, the power of community, and the eventual triumph of truth over deception in the land of ghost towns and railroad tracks.